Welcome to Voices of Australia, a podcast where we explore different perspectives on how to build a cohesive society. As recent data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics suggests, the spiritual landscape of our nation is undergoing a profound shift. With Christianity still the dominant faith, a rising 38.9% of Australians now identify as non-religious, while other faiths, such as Hinduism and Islam, continue to grow. How does this reflect the evolving dynamics of Australia's social fabric? What does it mean for social cohesion, individual rights and community harmony in our culturally diverse society? To delve deeper into these compelling questions, we've invited two extraordinary guests to our conversation today. Andrew West is a distinguished journalist, broadcaster and presenter of the Religion and Ethics Report on Radio National. With experience as a senior reporter with ABC and as the author of two culturally significant books, Andrew brings a wealth of knowledge on Australian politics and culture to the table. His work, featured in an array of international and national publication, reflects his comprehensive understanding of our social, religious and political landscape. Rabbi Gabby Coltman serves at the Ark Centre, a Jewish community centre leading a vibrant synagogue. Equipped with a Master of Social Work from Deakin University, Rabbi Gabby engages actively in various community roles, from an AFL multicultural ambassador and a Melbourne Fight Back Against Parkinson's charity chairman to an advisor to the Scanlon Foundation Research Advisory Committee. With his experiences in spiritual health and chaplaincy work, Rabbi Gabby offers valuable insights into the interplay between faith, community and societal progress. Welcome, Gabby and Andrew.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
We're absolutely delighted to have you. And I thought we might just start out by talking about how you both perceive the influence of religious beliefs on Australian society and its challenges today. Quite a broad question, so take it in whichever direction you would like. So perhaps, Andrew, you might like to grapple with that one first.
Well, thank you very much. I just also mention how valuable I find the work of the Scanlon Foundation. So I was very happy to take part in this because, as I say, I find the work very valuable. I find it comprehensive and it's a real window into Australia. So you guys will have as much knowledge about this as I do. I think the most compelling statistics that we can speak about are those of the most recent census, which you cited. And that showed that religious belief in Australia across all faiths is now down to about 53%. That isn't an entirely clear-cut picture, because while about 38% of people profess to have no religion, what it means is that they have no formal religious affiliation. It doesn't mean that they lack a hunger. It doesn't mean that they lack questions, a desire for deeper spiritual engagement. It does mean, however, and these are questions that we'll talk about later, I'm sure, that for a whole lot of reasons, they don't want to be formally affiliated, particularly with a Christian church. So Christianity is down to 43%. It's still a plurality of Australian believers. And then when we add in the other Abrahamic faiths and also Islam and also Hinduism and Buddhism, Sikhism, we end up with a faith community of between 53 and 55%. So the landscape that we face is one in which there is a diminishing influence of formal religion. And you have to say a diminishing respect for the leadership of formal religious institutions, particularly major Christian institutions. But at the same time, at the grassroots, if you look at things like the enrolment in faith-based schools, which is always a telling factor, that has held up quite well. Mm-hmm. So it means that some people see some, quote, instrumental value in religion, even if they don't want to buy into all of its precepts and tenets.
Rabbi, I suspect you've got a similar sort of approach, but certainly coming from the Jewish religion, you'd have experience around religious schools, as well as that overarching concern about the number of people that are actually attending services.
If the last census is sort of my guiding light. It is a worrying trend and something that I'm grappling with as a community rabbi, someone that heads a synagogue. Really, the beautiful thing about Judaism is that you don't need to be in an ashram or a synagogue or to connect with the God of Abraham. And during COVID and the like, I was screaming from the treetops to pray at home. God is there, especially during the high holidays and for life cycle events. We were doing them out of people's houses and online. And now seeing and trying to get congregants back into the synagogue is indeed quite tough. But at the same time, their connection to the synagogue and to myself is still there. They might not be actively participating as much as I, the rabbi, would like, but they're definitely connected, whether it's a Jewish holiday or a life cycle event and so forth. And tell you the truth, a lot of my thought and efforts are going towards trying to make the place of worship, the synagogue, in my particular case, relevant to Gen Z and millennials, which are also finding different ways to connect outside of organized religious structures and so forth.
Can I ask both of you whether or not there is a generational divide in this? Are you finding that older individuals within the community are attending more, or are they dropping off as well as younger people? Rabbi?
They participate and attend a lot more than younger generations, and for example, millennials and Gen Z and Y. And they are the core constituents as of now. But ultimately, Judaism is a religion of education. We're called the people of the book, the Jewish people. So ultimately, the emphasis is on the children, the next generation, and so many of our festivals are not based on celebrating different things that happened within the context of the Bible or Jewish history. They're rather based around that, but at the same time, how are we passing down the baton, and revolved around passing down the baton and making them relevant and teaching the next generation about their heritage, about their tradition, and what their identity is all about. Yeah. And that's going all the way back a millennia, also biblical times. So yes, are they participating as much as I would like to see them, or are the parents, and to use a nice Yiddish word, schlepping them to shul like they used to with previous generations? No, they're not. And we're seeing this great divide between sort of the grandparents and the grandchildren, but the intermediary, their children are not coming as much as their grandparents and their great-grandparents. And that's just the reality on the ground. And that's why I'm there to sort of schlep people back into shul and make an event and get those bums on the seats, which
having seen you in action, Gabby, I can understand how you're going about doing that. Andrew, what about you? What about the other religions? Certainly, the Catholic religions and others, are they seeing a similar generational divide?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm just looking now at the census data. And for example, the millennials had the highest proportion of people who identify with no religion, 46.5% compared with 38% across the population generally. It was definitely people Gen X, which is my generation, and older, who had a bias in favor of, this is just, for example, Christianity, had a stronger identification with Christianity. I mention that because it's the dominant faith. But yes, it's very much the case that that the millennials have the highest proportion of people who identify as no religion, higher, interestingly, than Gen Z, which is the next group down, people under the age of 25. And this, I think, also reflects some other research that's come out that says that Gen Z, so people on campuses now, are much more curious about religion while rejecting many of the formal affiliations, the structures, the formal authorities and hierarchies of religion, they're much more curious and open to discussions about faith, including with mainstream and historic faiths. They're not. It is not true to say. I mean, Rabbi Gabby, sitting here as our older brother, in the great competition or the great makeup of faiths, would know that it's not just a fascination with sort of faith or spiritual groups or affiliations or trends that came out from the 60s onwards. There's still among Gen Z a fascination and openness to the ancient faiths. But it does come down to a personal connection. And this is very interesting because religions that have and denominations that have, if you like, a very strong missional focus tend to survive better. So if you look, for example, at Anglicanism in its more traditional forms, it is diminishing because it doesn't have what's considered to be a strong missional focus, i.e. people deliberately going out recruiting. Rabbi Gabby will correct me on this, but it is many of the ultra-Orthodox communities that are actually growing quite well. I remember when I was at Columbia University in New York in the mid and late 1990s, every Friday, the Lubavitcher would be there outside the gates just before Shabbos, and they would be inviting people to Shabbos dinner, to some observance. They even approached me at one point. I said, "I'm very flattered that you asked, but I'm not Jewish." But I commend your effort. But it's religions and denominations that have a very strong missional focus that seem to be surviving and growing.
Gabby, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, I could tell you, Andrew, that the Lubavitchers, the Chabadniks that were outside the gates of your university, they are probably still there trying to get people to come to their Friday night meals, and they're booming. They're sort of outreach, which really they look at it as an inreach because this is their brethren. These are their brothers and sisters that might not be so in tune. They might be lacking a Shabbos meal, but they bring them back into the fold. And it's not just as the mission like that, which is that's their inspiration to go and bring people back into the fold in that particular Hasidic sect. But what I would say is that Judaism survived for so long, and through all the trials and tribulations and expulsions and massacres and the like, because there's that, in my opinion, that educational component of empowering the next generation. And yes, we might see a downward spiral of coming to synagogue, but the synagogue will always be there as a meeting place and a place for Jewish life cycle events to be celebrated and the like, a circumcision, a bar and bat mitzvah, weddings and mourning rituals and so forth. But where it really happens is within the Jewish home and the Jewish educational institutes. Which is a huge, huge emphasis on, regardless of how orthodox you are or how observant you might be, or your family.
So I'll come back to that. But Rabbi, just while I've got you, you described your time in Israel as formative and magical. I wondered if you could share more about how those experiences have influenced your approach to your religious duties here in Australia, and how that keeps. What are the things that were your experience there in Israel that you want others to experience as well?
Israel, it was at the formative years in my life, and being surrounded by Jewish people, kosher food, that sense of brotherhood, sisterhood within the Jewish startup nation. It was just incredibly special because, as we say, we are mishpacha, we are family, the famous saying goes. And then I did a stint in the mystical city of Sfat, which is in the north of Israel, which was just incredible, being there at a rabbinical school, followed by a year and a half of receiving my rabbinical ordination in Jerusalem, and going down to the Western Wall, living in the rabbinical seminary that I was in, receiving my ordination, but really being immersed in not just Jewish theory, theology, and practice, which is what I sort of live with now, even as a rabbi and an Orthodox Jew. But when you have that day in, day out, and you're immersed in it, you're bathing in it, it's just incredibly spiritual, and it's lasted with me so much so when I first got married almost a decade ago, and insisted that with my wife that we go spend the first couple months of our marriage back again in Jerusalem, which is just another incredibly spiritual and enlightening experience, and so forth. And anyone listening out there, if you haven't been to the Holy Land, you must. It will give you a better and broader context of what's happening over there. But at the same time, regardless of which faith background you're from or you practice, there will be something there for you.
Yeah, thank you, because that is a very. I think that a lot of people seek that type of connection to something in their lives. And that brings a wholeness to how you experience the world, certainly from a spiritual perspective, regardless of what religion you follow. Andrew, there is quite a bit of conversation right now about Israel from a political perspective, and you've spent quite a bit of time examining religion in public life. I wondered whether or not you see politics having any sort of an influence on people's approach to religion, or how it might influence public opinion at the moment, and does that have an influence on how people might gravitate towards that more formal religious institutions?
Yes, I do. And some of the most instructive data and experience actually comes out of the United States. A lot is made, and it will probably have some relevance in Australia too, but a lot is made of the so-called evangelical right vote in the United States. What people, I think, don't fully understand is that white evangelicalism, in inverted commas, because there's a very large black evangelical community in the United States as well. It doesn't use the descriptor of evangelical. But if you just talk, for example, about the white evangelical vote, it's actually shrinking as a percentage of the American electorate. I think it's down to about 15%, which will surprise people who think that, I heard one writer a few years ago say it was 70%. I thought, a quick Google search would have corrected that. But what is the reason for this? What is the reason for it diminishing as a percentage of the population in the United States? It's not because people are rejecting its religious precepts, but what they have rejected over the past 20 to 30 years, most intently, although it's been happening for 50 years, is its involvement in everyday politics. People do not like the enmeshment of their faith and their politics. And that has been a big problem for evangelicals in the United States. They may be a mobilizing force, for example, within the Republican Party, but they're losing ground among Americans because they're too enmeshed in the United States, in US politics. In Australia, I've noticed, especially after Scott Morrison became Prime Minister, there was a real reluctance, I have to say, of many evangelical and Pentecostal leaders to get involved in politics because they saw that, it's just not the way to grow and sustain a congregation. People shy away from religion when it's too associated with politics. They were very anxious, evangelical and Pentecostal leaders in this country, at least, in my observation. They were very reluctant to be owned by one side of politics. And while it was great for them to have, for Pentecostal Christians, which are a very fast-growing group of Christians, especially among non-Anglos. I mean, the great growth of Pentecostal Christianity in this country is Australians of African background, of Latin American background, and of Chinese background. They were very, very, while it may have been great to have one of their brethren as the Prime Minister, they were very keen not to be owned by one particular side of politics. So, you can take the United States as a lesson for dangers of too much political involvement by religious groups.
Rabbi, I'm curious about your view about this, because when it comes to such incredibly important issues as discrimination, there is a need for a particular religious group to actually have a voice to those leaders that can make some type of an impact in that space, or at least speak to the fact that certain types of behaviours, certain types of symbols are not appropriate in a society such as ours. Do you have a view about that relationship between religion and politics?
So, yeah, they're two separate things. I think one is sort of lived experience. So me being the grandson of a Holocaust survivor and my grandfather lost his sister, older sister, his younger brother, his parents, and extended family to the Nazis and in the concentration camps, and understanding the danger of hate symbols, for example, the Nazi swastika in this particular scenario, especially here in Victoria, is now banned, and soon the Victorian government is going to ban the Nazi salute. Is working on banning the Nazi salute, followed by, I think it will come eventually, other Nazi and hate symbols. But that's important to speak to government, because we know, because via lived experience 75 years ago, and just to let our listeners know that the highest portion per capita of Holocaust survivors settled in Melbourne outside of Israel. Just understand that the majority of the Jewish community, a significant percentage, have grandparents, now even great-grandparents, that are living or have passed, that were survivors of the Holocaust. So we understand what happens via these hate symbols and hate speech. Hitler and the Nazi Party, they rose to power. It wasn't overnight. It was via speech and symbols. And slowly we saw 6 million Jews, including 1 million children, as well as other members of minority communities, being gassed and killed. Concentration camps. So we, our lived experience and understanding of what happened to our families, we come to government and we say, this is, it's a slippery slope when people can freely get away with this type of discrimination and this hate rhetoric. But back to what we were just talking about earlier, I just want to say, as a rabbi, I try and keep it kosher. I don't, from the pulpit especially, try and be bipartisan. I love everybody, but at the same time, I don't feel Australians, and I can talk about my congregation, I don't think, and I know they don't appreciate it, and I try not to, and don't rarely talk politics from the pulpit. You are a rabbi, a rabbi is a teacher, you're a religious leader, and so forth. What happens in, in wider sort of society, especially within the political realm, you might have your own personal opinion, but that's not really supposed to be preached from the pulpit. And going back to what you were saying, Andrew, I feel that my American rabbinical colleagues feel a lot more empowered to pick a political side. And you can see that from, the East Coast, West Coast, and, from some of their sermons over the high holidays, there's a lot of political undertones over there. Whereas I think the Australian electorate, yes, there might be politicians that might worship or have a religion that they're very proud of and open about. But once that starts informing their politics, I think we see from the past and even recent past elections, the Australian electorate doesn't really resonate with them. And I see that also with my community.
Yeah.
I'm a rabbi, but I'm not there to talk politics.
Gabby and Andrew, I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about social cohesion and the role that religion can play and has played around this sense of belonging. But Rabbi, I wonder if you might mention, because I had the great opportunity to experience an event you held during Ramadan, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what was the driver for that particular, tell people what that event was, but what the driver was and what the impact has been since then.
We hosted at my synagogue and community center, the Ark Center, we hosted a iftar dinner in the middle of Ramadan. And from what I'm hearing from my colleagues around Australia, this was in Australia first, that a synagogue on a Friday night, so we welcome the Sabbath, and then share the platform, the synagogue, with Muslim brothers and sisters, welcome them into the synagogue, and also allow them to worship and have their call of prayer within the synagogue. But people forget that ultimately we worship the Abrahamic God. So there's so many parallels, and that's really one of my motives around this. That's one of my great, I think, calls in a way here. We live in a lucky country. We're so blessed, and I just love sitting across the table from somebody from a different faith background, a different religious background, or secular background, and learning from them. And I feel by doing that, we just bring down so many barriers, so many misunderstandings, misconceptions, and that in essence is going to assist and make what we're all looking to get, that bright light at the end of the tunnel, which is ultimately that social cohesion, more tolerance, less anti-Semitism, less Islamophobia, less discrimination, is by sitting across from each other and breaking bread. And if the more we can do that, well, the more we should.
Absolutely. Andrew, you talked before about young people and their interest in religions. I know when I was a long time ago back in school and we had the opportunity to learn about a whole variety of religions, that was far more attractive to me than going to church on a Friday morning or whatever it might have been. So given that there's that degree of interest and knowledge and awareness amongst young people that are moving away potentially from these more formal affiliations, how important are these type of cross-religion conversations when it comes to social cohesion, building that sort of understanding across the population of how important that the diverse religions are in Australia?
They're critical, and I have to say what Rabbi Gabby is doing is clearly working, because the data shows that we actually have a great appreciation of the strength of religious diversity in this country. And it's paradoxical, but younger people less willing to profess a religion, but also much more tolerant and welcoming of other faiths. I mean, this is a remarkably, I will not accept a tale of woe here, because this is a remarkably successful country when it has come to interfaith relationships. It's a remarkably successful country when it comes to freedom of religion. There's going to be continuing debate about the extent to which faith communities have the right to pass on the values of their particular texts and their traditions and faith, and where they clash with other human rights. That's an ongoing debate. I accept that. But as a general rule, this is a remarkably successful and cohesive country when it comes to religious freedom and religious practice. And I think the Pew Research in the United States also points this out. We have we have almost no religiously motivated violence in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I mean, certainly 20 years ago, there was a paranoia after 9/11. It was understandable, but we have today almost no religiously motivated violence in this country. There are groups on the far right groups that are mobilized and inspired by a toxic online content that do pose a problem, and the intelligence agencies are very aware of this. They've publicized it. But as a general rule, this is a country with, great religious comity, and that is very, very important, because as immigration grows, because this is one of the strengths of Australia, as immigration grows, so will our religious diversity. Hinduism Islam, and Sikhism are the three fastest growing religions. And that's only going to continue, which makes it even more important that people like Rabbi Gabby continue their interfaith outreach. I just make this point too. If we go back to the United States, because it's such a great laboratory of this, a lot of once quite conservative Christian groups have realized that their religious freedom is best guaranteed by extending the religious freedom to peoples of other faiths. So, for example, the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, they have been extremely active in promoting religious liberty for all Americans, no matter what their faith background, because they know in the end it guarantees their own religious liberty as well. It's not just a statement of principle, it's a pragmatic position as well that I think faith leaders in Australia recognise as well.
Yes, absolutely. You've talked to Andrew about the importance of sort of humanities and social sciences as being a really important component of people's education, so that there's a greater acceptance of intellectual diversity as well as acceptance of diversity within particular components of people's lives. Did you want to comment at all about that importance of intellectual diversity as well as and its role in social cohesion, if you like?
There are clearly outer boundaries of comment and behaviour, and I would argue even certain forms of intellectual inquiry that we need to observe. But I would that, and we're talking here, and this goes back to the point that Rabbi Gabby was making, and you made earlier about laws, affecting things like the display of the swastika. You can clearly see a very formidable case for those kind of boundaries. I think you were referring to a piece that I wrote a few years ago, about the previous government and its decision to raise tertiary education fees disproportionately on people who studied things like history, political science, anthropology, religious studies. My point there was simply that these are subjects and disciplines that broaden our knowledge of the world, and even for practical purposes, why would you want a country that is less knowledgeable about these things? Why would you want an Australia that is less knowledgeable about our closest neighbour, that is Indonesia, the world's fastest growing Muslim country, a fascinating place where Indonesians themselves are working out the tensions between Orthodox and more liberal Islam, and where do we find the balance? Indonesia is a fascinating country. Why would you want a country and a population that's educated less in those areas? That was just one example that I was making.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Yeah. Rabbi, I'm curious too, because there is quite a bit of diversity within the Jewish faith, and I'm wondering whether or not that is something that is how do we recognize the particular nuances of how people follow their religions, but also understand how that contributes to social cohesion?
There are different there's different avenues of worship and faith within the Jewish religion, but there's the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, there's conservative, and there's Reform. But throughout all those different sects or ways of worship are really common denominators, and they are the Jewish life cycle events, the Jewish calendar, and the prayers. So if you walk into my synagogue, for example, which is an Orthodox synagogue, and then to the Reform synagogue down the road, there will be a lot of commonalities between the way we worship. A lot of it will be done in Hebrew, some in English, but there will be a lot of parallels. It won't feel like you're walking into a different language or a different time or a different world, for example. And so much so, a lot of the peak bodies in Victoria fall under the one umbrella of the JCCV, the Jewish Community Council Victoria. So there is that element of harmony. There are also a lot of people, regardless of where they worship, they go to the same schools and so forth. So there is, in a way, a separation between the educational system and the synagogues, and there are those many crossovers and the like. Obviously, we could do more. It would be great to do a little bit of more outreach with sort of the Reform and the conservative community, with the Orthodox community. But all in all, everybody mainly gets along and so forth. There might be some rabbinical bodies that are different, and it just depends on where you subscribe to, whether you're looking for an answer when it comes to Jewish law from the Orthodox rabbi or from conservative Reform rabbi. That's really where the difference is.
True. There is, so the Jewish religion really does inform, and I'm speaking from a very ignorant background, but does inform virtually every aspect of your daily life, or one's daily life, if you're following that particular religion. And I'm really curious about how, coming to a relatively secular society like Australia, there are times when taking on a religion or being a part of a religion has to adapt to certain other requirements that happen within this society. And is that something that's been an easy pathway for Jewish people living here in Australia? Have they found interesting ways to develop certain institutions that help? I know there's an ambulance service that abides by certain religious requirements. Are there things here that have made it difficult or easy for the Jewish community to adapt?
I think when you have the lucky country that we are, Australia, and that freedom of religion and that tolerance, and it hasn't always been, this utopia of tolerance, which it is, this bastion of sort of freedom to worship as you please. There was, there's times of, and has been times of great discrimination that the Jewish community has faced, especially when they first came, and the first wave of immigration as they came with their Italian and Greek immigrant communities. There was huge in the 50s and 60s. But at the same time, it was sort of chin down and get the job done. And these people were Holocaust survivors. This was nothing compared to where they were a decade before, and so forth. And because we've survived historically by carving out this enclave within society of community, of family, and the support institutions without it, within it, to support the destitute, to support the poor, the widow, and the orphan, and those that are needy. So we've always had that element of tzedakah, or charity, or loving kindness, which is glued to Judaism, to the Bible, and really has kept us together as a religion and as a community. So we've always had that element there. So when people were downtrodden, weren't doing as well, there was always that fallback, which is the beauty of community and so forth, which the Jewish community has seen. And then when we go out into the world as Jews, we make do, whether we're actively, with a kippah, with the head covering and the sit like I do, or we just there as Jewish people, and at times we need to talk about it and so forth. But I'm seeing now it's a lot more common, and people quite understand what it means when somebody keeps kosher. And I think with the rise of vegetarianism, veganism, and so forth, it's just a lot more sort of understood. Oh, you're kosher, and therefore, and I think that's the beauty of sort of how we've evolved as a society and as Australians and so forth. And yes, there is that first responders ambulance system within the Jewish community, which it doesn't just service Jews. Anybody can get their number and call them if they have sadly a crisis and a medical episode, that you can call the Hatzalah and they'll come to you. There's no, obviously, God forbid, any discrimination. They're there within the local area. And that's just sort of the way the community mobilize. When there's a need for something, or when somebody needs assistance, or something needs to get built, or something
they come together.
We come together. And historically, that's how we've always been.
And solve problems.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that's sometimes because we're being so under the pump and so just discriminated against and so forth. But what I'm seeing now, and beautifully, is that the families and the communities that have done this are now giving back to wider Australian society, which is just amazing. Some of those Jewish foundations, Jewish family foundations and philanthropic, it's not just we're taking care of our own, and it's for a long time it hasn't been like that. It's we are going to help the wider society, which is just special to watch.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'll just add one interesting observation there too, in terms of the contribution to broader Australian life. One of the most powerful statistics recently was that after the bushfire appeals, after the bushfires, some of the biggest donations, running into the tens of thousands, but sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, actually came from mosques raised at Friday prayers. So, it is another demonstration of how faith communities are very eager to be part of the Australian story, not set themselves aside from it, but to be deeply entrenched in the Australian story. And I mean, you made an interesting comment there, Anthea, and it's a common observation. I differ slightly where you referred to Australia as a secular society. Australia is a country with secular governance, and that is how it should be. Our constitution guarantees that we have religiously neutral government, but I would argue that we are a pluralist society. We're a pluralist society, secular governance, as it should be, but a pluralist society. It is very hard to welcome. If you believe in multiculturalism, you have to welcome religious freedom as part of that. It doesn't work. A multicultural society cannot work unless it guarantees religious liberty. You can't have one without the other.
Yes, no, my apologies, because I didn't actually mean it in that way.
Don't apologise. It is the dominant comment that's made, but it's just one that I slightly differ with.
No, I absolutely appreciate the clarification too, because I must admit I'd thought of it more as there is no dominant religion that we expect everybody to follow, but you're absolutely right. I should have, that would be a better way of saying it. But I'm sort of following on from where the rabbi was making these comments. I wondered whether or not you might be able to talk about examples of other religions that are adapting to a more modern context, that some of their particular pathways are changing or their practices.
Yeah, Anthea, this is a very good question, because it's a really live debate within faith communities. I'd best speak about it, for example, among Christians. There is an argument as to, we have to be more relevant, i.e. we have to be more in tune politically or socially, with the times for us to grow. The problem is that doesn't always hold up to scrutiny. Rodney Stark, the Canadian sociologist of religion, argued that it's religions that remained more orthodox that tended to survive, if not prosper, during tough times. And I'm afraid that, if you look again at the United States, I hate to keep going back there, but it is the great religious laboratory. Liberal Protestantism in the United States is diminishing at a rapid rate. You think of the Episcopal Church in the United States, which has been the church of presidents, of Supreme Court justices, the church of the American aristocracy, and there is a certain American aristocracy. There's less in the United States. There's probably fewer than 1 million people attending Episcopal churches every Sunday now. And the Episcopal Church has been at the absolute vanguard of liberal change. It hasn't worked. It has not worked for them. African-American churches continue to prosper, partly because, they are the basis of so much African-American community life and unity, but they're also seen to be pretty faithful to their doctrine, even when it might seem unpopular in certain parts of the United States. In Australia, the most progressive Christian church, the Uniting Church, saw one of the biggest drop-offs in attendance in the last census. The Uniting Church congregations are old, as are most Anglican congregations as well. Where there is growth, for example, in the Uniting Church, it's coming in Pacific Islander and South Korean and Chinese congregations, and they tend to be more orthodox in their religious views. So, Anthea, it's an excellent question that you ask, but there's no simple answer to it, because while churches and other faith organizations look at new technologies to reach out to new believers, if they're seen to drift in a spiritual or doctrinal sense, they don't necessarily bring in a whole lot of new believers.
Yeah. There is, just as a final question, and so I want to thank both of you for this very stimulating conversation. There is a sense in our data, certainly, that the sense of belonging is dropping off, particularly in younger people, but that overall there is a reduction in people's sense of belonging. But it has been suggested to me that part of the reason for that is that the attraction of churches or religious institutions as places to go or to experience that sense of belonging that both of you have actually talked to, that real sense of rejuvenation that you experience in those particular places. The fact that there isn't that much people gravitating there. And I know that there are certainly intergenerational issues where older folks really wish that their younger children or grandchildren were attending more of these experiences to get that sense of what religion can bring and spirituality can bring to your life. Just as a final thought, what do you think are the potential implications of where religion is at the present time in Australia?
I think we're seeing people that are incredibly spiritual, but as we've been talking about, might not feel like going into a organized place of worship. Those spiritual elements that they're finding, and the care that they're giving themselves, whether it's self-care, whether it's meditation, whether it's prayer or going to group therapy sessions or finding that community online, I think it's cyclical, and that's where it is now. But I think that in-person community and coming to synagogue to gather together, don't write off organized places of worship just yet. And we saw how integral they were during the pandemic and how they mobilized the communities that might not have, the congregants and members that might not have come there in an extended period of time in person, but ultimately that was their source of connection. Of course, we're seeing that rise in loneliness, and we see that across the board from all the data. So whilst they're getting the spiritual needs from wherever they may be, and we're seeing also that online, it's not ultimately a substitute for congregational in-person worship. And I think there will be a resurgence in it. I know within the Jewish faith, there will always be a necessity and need for synagogues, for shuls, for in-person gatherings. We're about to hit the grand final season, the final season within Judaism with the upcoming high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where, I see a lot of people one time a year, one or two times a year in a very short space within a week, because they come Rosh Hashanah and they listen to the shofar, they listen to the ram song being blown, and then they're out of there, and then they come back 10 days later for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. They shake my hand and, how are you, Rabbi? And I get the shalom, it's nice to see you, and I'll see you next year. So they're finding it in different ways, but rabbis, synagogues, and again, across places of worship across the spectrum, I think we'll see a resurgence, even though at the moment there is a downward trend. But as people don't get what they're really craving, which is in-person contact, community, camaraderie, in person, not just online, not over the phone, I think they'll start coming back. But we will have to adapt. It won't be the same as it was a couple decades ago. And we'll evolve, obviously, within the parameters of Jewish law and orthodoxy and so forth. But that's, something that I grapple with. How will we when people start? Yeah.
Well, I'd certainly encourage everybody to look up Pillars of Light and to consider attending that event, because that's very special. But Andrew, I just wondered if you'd like to have the last word.
Not something I usually get, either at home or at work. But look, I'm so glad that Rabbi Gabby sort of made that reference to the grand final season in Judaism. But it reminds me, for example, of what the great American sociologist Robert Bellah wrote in his book about the habits of the heart, but also the Australian sociologist John Carroll has also spoken about, and that is this idea of a civic religion. People do need and crave rituals, and they'll seek them out particularly in this country in sporting events. We are just in our DNA, social animals, social people. There's a saying in the Bantu, among the Bantu people of Africa, that people are people through other people. That is how we realize our humanity. On the question of faiths, look, the thing, and this is going to be a generational problem, at least for the Christian churches, is the sex abuse crisis. It's going to be I just throw it in at the end, not normally the place where we start these discussions, but it's a generational crisis, a generational challenge. It won't be overcome for several decades. But it doesn't undermine that question that people have about metaphysical things, about why as opposed to how. And that question remains, as does our hankering for human interaction. Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone 21 years ago, and he pinged at the time television as the thing that had undermined social and community life. I have to say, I think our online world has continued to undermine that a fair bit. And I can only hope that rather than entrenching our online habits, that COVID and our liberation from it's not over, but broadly speaking, our liberation from it prompts a rediscovery of community life. And in that comes a rediscovery of faith life as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's a great place to finish. So I very much appreciate your joining me, and Rabbi Gabby also. I appreciate the fact that both of you have participated in this very engaging and very interesting conversation. So thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you to Rabbi Gabby. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And thanks very much, Anthea, and to Faisal Farah as well, who helped set this up. I really appreciate it. It's a really worthwhile thing. And I really just pay tribute to the ongoing work of the Scanlon Foundation.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voices of Australia podcast, brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. This podcast is produced by me, Faisal Farah, and with audio, visual, recording and editing by John Bigelow from Interactive Media Solutions. Research for each episode is provided by Agalos Makdijorjos and Matthew Skidmore. Original music is by Steve Klapsinos. Learn more about the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute and all its works by visiting the website www.scanloninstitute.org.au.